Picture yourself in the heart of ancient Rome. The air is thick with dust and anticipation. 50,000 voices roar inside the Colosseum, their excitement rising like a living beast. The sun beats down on the sand below, where a wooden gate creaks open and a man in chains stumbles forward. Behind him, a lion, starved for days, bursts into the arena, its roar shaking the stone walls. The crowd erupts. For them, this isn't a tragedy. It's entertainment. What began centuries earlier as solemn funeral rites to honor the dead has become a finely tuned machine of death. Ritual sacrifice transformed into theater, religious duty into political spectacle. Rome had perfected a new art form, an art not of creation, but of destruction. Every drop of blood spilled on that sand carried meaning, a warning to enemies, a promise to the people, and a performance for the powerful. These spectacles were never just about gladiators fighting. They were about control. They were about teaching conquered nations what defiance would cost, about proving the emperor's divine authority, about binding society together through shared violence. The Romans built arenas not just to kill, but to astonish, with trapdoors, naval battles, human torches, and mythological reenactments where death was always real. This was the empire's greatest export, orchestrated death, delivered as entertainment. And for nearly 700 years, it worked. But behind the cheering crowds and the engineering marvels lay shattered lives, broken families, and an enduring question: why does humanity find such fascination in cruelty? Today, we step into those blood-soaked sands to uncover the true story of Rome's arena, more horrifying, and more revealing, than you've ever imagined. Long before the roar of the Colosseum shook the skies of Rome, before the emperors raised their hands to decide who lived and who died, the blood on Roman sand flowed for a very different reason. What we now imagine as grand spectacles of entertainment began in shadows of grief and in the solemn silence of death. The earliest accounts trace these rituals back to the Etruscans, the mysterious civilization that thrived in Italy centuries before Rome's rise. The Etruscans believed that honoring the dead required more than offerings of food or prayer. They believed blood itself was sacred. To guide a soul into the afterlife, life had to be taken in return. Archaeological discoveries from Etruscan tombs reveal frescoes of armed men clashing in ceremonial combat, grim reminders that to bury the dead was also to spill blood in their honor. When the Romans absorbed Etruscan customs, they brought this practice with them. But as always, Rome twisted tradition into something bigger, something sharper, something that could serve its insatiable hunger for power. What began as a private act of piety was transformed into a public display. The first recorded Roman gladiatorial games date to 264 BCE. A nobleman named Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva wished to honor his deceased father. Instead of incense or song, he ordered 3 pairs of slaves to fight to the death in the Forum. It was a small, almost intimate event by later standards, but it planted the seed of an institution that would grow monstrous in size. The crowd that gathered that day did not look away. They leaned forward. They felt something stir within them. The Latin word munus means duty or gift. At first, the combat was truly that, a duty owed to the dead, a gift to their memory. Families believed the blood spilled in combat nourished the spirits of ancestors, ensuring protection for those still living. It was a spiritual transaction, brutal but purposeful. When a man fell in the sand, he was not just dying, he was completing a sacred exchange between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But Rome was never a society content with ritual alone. It was pragmatic, ambitious, and deeply political. Anything that could display wealth, influence, or power would eventually be harnessed for public consumption. Blood, once meant only for the gods and the dead, became currency among the living. The funeral games, munera, grew in scope with every generation. Wealthy families began to compete. If one senator staged 10 pairs of fighters, another would try for 20. Soon, hosting games was no longer about religion but reputation. An extravagant display of combat could secure political favor, sway the masses, or intimidate rivals. The more blood that was spilled, the greater the prestige. By the 2nd century BCE, what had begun in funerals now spilled into festivals. The sands of Rome turned crimson not only to honor the departed but to thrill the living. The historian Pliny the Elder noted how quickly these rites decayed into indulgence and ambition. What once honored the dead now dishonored the living, he wrote, yet no one could deny the magnetic pull of the spectacle. The transformation of sacred into profane was gradual but unstoppable. Picture the funeral of a wealthy patrician in the late Republic. The solemn procession through Rome's streets would end not in quiet mourning but in a bloodbath staged before thousands of spectators. Slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war were forced into the arena, their deaths no longer offerings for one man's ancestors but entertainment for the entire city. Still, traces of the old religious roots lingered. Excavations beneath early amphitheaters reveal ritual burials, human remains laid beneath the very floor where others would die. Priests of Mercury, god of boundaries and transitions, entered the arena after each fight. With a sacred hammer, they struck fallen gladiators to ensure their souls had crossed into the afterlife. Even as Rome turned religion into politics, fragments of belief clung to the edges of the spectacle. As Rome expanded its empire, so too did its appetite for violence. Conquered cultures contributed their own flavors of brutality. From the Greeks came athletic competition. From the Celts, ritualistic combat techniques. From the Carthaginians, exotic animals to hunt. Each conquest fed new blood into the growing machine, shaping a system that consumed thousands of lives each year. The Romans had perfected something chilling, the ability to take tradition, reshape it, and scale it until it lost all trace of its original meaning. What began as an intimate duty of grief had become a weapon of social control. A senator who staged extravagant games could secure votes and rise in power. A general returning from conquest could slaughter prisoners in the arena to cement his glory. Even ordinary citizens, invited to witness death, were drawn deeper into Rome's system of dominance. One might wonder, did the people not question this? Did they not recoil at turning the most solemn of human moments into blood sport? Some did. Philosophers like Cicero and Seneca would later write of their discomfort. But the truth is, most Romans accepted it as natural. Death was everywhere in their world, on the battlefield, in the streets, in the fields ravaged by war. To see it ritualized, contained within the walls of an arena, felt not only acceptable but oddly reassuring. There was something intoxicating about it. To sit in the stands was to feel both safe and powerful. Safe, because the violence was directed at others. Powerful, because in cheering or jeering, the crowd joined in the judgment of life and death. Even if they could not raise the emperor's thumb, the spectators' cries shaped the theater of cruelty. Thus, by the time Rome transitioned from republic to empire, the games had already transcended their funeral origins. They were no longer about guiding the souls of the dead but about shaping the destiny of the living. Blood was now a tool of governance, and the arena, once a place of ritual mourning, had become the stage upon which Rome displayed its might. And so, what began with 3 pairs of slaves in 264 BCE evolved into a tradition that would last nearly 7 centuries. From a duty to the ancestors to an empire's most feared instrument of power, the path was paved with blood. The sand of the arena, once sacred ground for honoring the dead, had become something new, a killing field where death was scripted, orchestrated, and applauded. As the centuries passed, the ritual of shedding blood for the dead began to change. It was no longer just about honoring ancestors or appeasing spirits, it became about prestige, influence, and power. Rome, always a society hungry for competition and ambition, transformed funeral games into a stage for politics. The sand of the arena was no longer sacred ground for grief, it became a currency for advancement. By the 2nd century BCE, wealthy Roman families realized that funerals were not merely private affairs. They were opportunities to broadcast status. Hosting gladiatorial contests became a way to impress neighbors, allies, and even rivals. If a senator provided a modest game with 10 pairs of fighters, another would outdo him with 20, or even 30. The contests became a grotesque form of one-upmanship, where blood equaled prestige. The transformation was subtle at first, but soon unmistakable. What had once been a somber duty morphed into calculated investment. Families poured fortunes into securing fighters, exotic animals, and elaborate staging. The combat was brutal, but the real battle was fought outside the arena, in the competition for public favor. Votes, alliances, and reputations could be won or lost in the spectacle of blood. Julius Caesar understood this truth better than anyone. In 65 BCE, he staged games that featured hundreds of gladiators, an unprecedented number at the time. It was not grief that drove him, but ambition. Caesar's contests electrified the public and terrified his rivals. Every thrust of a sword was also a message: here is a man powerful enough to orchestrate death on a massive scale. His path to dictatorship was paved, in part, with the bodies of those who fought in his name. Rome's politicians quickly recognized the power of the arena. The Senate, which once tried to restrict gladiatorial contests, found itself embracing them as a tool of governance. The philosopher Juvenal would later mock this system with his famous phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Keep the people fed and entertained, he wrote, and they would remain obedient. It was cynicism distilled into policy. The games provided a controlled outlet for violence, a distraction from hunger or discontent, and a visible reminder of the state's absolute authority. The presence of the emperor at the games added another dimension. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, perfected the use of the arena as political theater. When he attended, he was not simply a spectator. He was the arbiter of life and death. The image of the emperor sitting in the imperial box, the entire crowd watching for his signal, created a symbolic truth that words could never capture: the empire itself decided fate. Whether or not the famous, thumbs up or thumbs down, gesture actually existed, the essence of the myth rings true: the rulers will determine survival. The games also became staggering economic enterprises. Records from Pompeii reveal that a single day of gladiatorial combat could cost the equivalent of a senator's annual income. Gladiators were valuable property. A skilled fighter might be worth the price of a luxury villa, making each death both a human tragedy and a financial blow. To support this economy, gladiator schools, or ludi, sprang up across the empire. These were not just training grounds, but full-scale institutions with trainers, doctors, cooks, and guards. Inside the ludi, men lived in cramped cells, drilling daily, preparing for combat that might be their last. Owners invested heavily in their fighters, ensuring they received medical treatment to recover from injuries and return to the arena. The paradox was stark: men were preserved so they could be killed another day. In Rome, even compassion was transactional. But the brutality served a larger purpose than profit or popularity. The arena was a stage for lessons. Every criminal thrown to the beasts, every rebellious slave forced to fight, carried a message: this is the fate of those who defy Rome. The games were not just entertainment, they were pedagogy by fear. The state used blood to write its authority into the hearts of citizens and subjects alike. And yet, not everyone accepted this transformation. The philosopher Seneca once confessed that he attended a show reluctantly, hoping for athletic skill or bravery. Instead, he watched helpless men butchered for amusement. He left the arena, he wrote, more cruel, more inhuman, simply from being among people who celebrated such cruelty. His words capture the corrupting effect of the spectacle, not just on those who died, but on those who watched. Still, the momentum of the games was unstoppable. Rome was a society built on conquest, and the arena mirrored its identity. To be Roman was to dominate, to conquer, to consume. The gladiatorial contests became a condensed version of empire itself: orchestrated violence, public dominance, and the illusion of control. Picture a festival in the late Republic. A wealthy senator stands before the crowd, basking in applause as dozens of gladiators march into the arena. The crowd roars, bread is tossed into the stands, and for a moment, the people forget hunger, debt, or political turmoil. All eyes fix on the sand below. Each death is both spectacle and symbol. Each drop of blood reinforces the state's grip. This was the genius, and the horror, of Rome. The games were not merely a pastime. They were a mechanism, a system carefully engineered to keep the population obedient and the elite powerful. In the thunder of applause, the screams of the dying were drowned out. By the 1st century BCE, gladiatorial combat was no longer just ritual. It was politics in its purest, most brutal form. A senator's ambition, a general's triumph, an emperor's authority, all were written in blood across the sand. And for nearly 700 years, Romans filled their arenas to watch the lesson repeated: life and death belong to those who rule. When most people think of Rome's games, they imagine the Colosseum, its towering arches, its grand staircases, its sheer size dominating the skyline. But the Colosseum was not just a building. It was a machine, meticulously designed to turn death into theater. Every stone, every chamber, every hidden mechanism existed for one purpose: to make killing both efficient and spectacular. The Romans called it the Amphitheatrum Flavium when it opened in 80 CE. It could seat around 50,000 spectators, arranged in precise social order. Senators and priests sat closest to the arena floor, near enough to see sweat and blood glisten on the bodies of combatants. Wealthy equestrians occupied the next tier. Ordinary citizens filled the higher seats, while women and the poor were banished to the uppermost rows. Even in death, Rome preserved hierarchy. Beneath the oval arena lay the hypogeum, a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and elevators. Here, gladiators, prisoners, and animals waited in darkness for their moment on stage. Engineers constructed elaborate systems of pulleys and counterweights that could lift cages, platforms, and even entire stage sets into the arena. To a spectator above, it seemed as though lions materialized from nowhere, or armed men rose suddenly from the ground. These appearances were timed to shock, to terrify, to thrill. Trapdoors dotted the arena floor. One moment, a gladiator might believe he faced a single opponent. The next, hidden doors would slam open and a pack of wild beasts would rush out, starved and furious. The element of surprise was built into the architecture. Rome understood suspense. It understood drama. The sand itself, the arena from which we get the word arena, was no simple surface. It was carefully chosen to absorb blood and provide footing for combatants. Beneath the sand, drainage systems carried away blood, water, and waste, preventing the floor from becoming unmanageable. Movable barriers allowed the floor to be reconfigured between events. One day it might host duels, the next day naval battles, the next a mass execution. Yes, naval battles. The Colosseum and other arenas were designed with complex water systems that allowed organizers to flood the floor to a depth of several feet. With astonishing speed, the killing field transformed into a shallow lake. Condemned prisoners and slaves were forced onto scaled-down warships, reenacting famous naval battles of Rome's past. These naumachii were spectacles of chaos, ships colliding, men drowning, fire arrows hissing across the artificial water. The engineering required was so advanced that similar waterworks would not be seen in Europe for another 1,000 years. And the spectacle was not just visual, it was auditory. The elliptical design of amphitheaters naturally amplified sound. The clash of swords, the roar of lions, the cries of the dying, all carried with clarity to the highest seats. Passages known as vomitoria, designed for quick movement of crowds, doubled as acoustic chambers. They directed sound waves so that the violence below could be heard in every corner. Rome understood that sound was part of the show. Every aspect of the seating arrangements was calculated to maximize psychological impact. The emperor's box, placed at the heart of the action, symbolized ultimate authority. His presence reminded spectators that Rome itself held the power of life and death. The wealthy elite sat close enough to smell blood and hear last words, while the masses above still had perfect sightlines, ensuring no one missed the reality of death. Even the cheapest seats offered what modern stadium designers would envy. Animals from every corner of the empire were shipped in to fuel the spectacles. Lions from Africa, tigers from the east, elephants, crocodiles, bears, all kept in underground cages until the moment of release. Trainers devised elaborate systems of ramps and lifts to coordinate their appearances. At the right moment, gates swung open, and chaos erupted. Audiences gasped not only at the danger but at the precision with which it was staged. Rome had literally architected death. The arena was not simply a place of killing, it was a stage where killing was choreographed. The boundaries between warfare, theater, and ritual blurred. To step into the Colosseum was to enter a world where human life was reduced to performance, and performance was sharpened into cruelty. The scale of planning was staggering. Behind the scenes, hundreds of workers operated machinery, moved scenery, prepared animals, and coordinated timing. Stagehands drenched wooden props in pitch so they could be ignited for dramatic fires. Engineers triggered sudden collapses of scenery, simulating earthquakes or mythological disasters. To the audience, it seemed as though the gods themselves participated in the spectacle. Fire, water, blood, sound, Rome manipulated every element. The amphitheater was a universe where natural forces bent to imperial will. The message was clear: if Rome could control even nature itself, how could any subject hope to resist? For condemned prisoners, entering the arena was to enter a nightmare designed with cruel artistry. They might be forced to play a role in a mythological reenactment, Orpheus, Prometheus, Deadliest, before being killed in ways that mimicked legend. They were not just executed, they were made into unwilling actors, their deaths a climactic act in Rome's theater of power. What made the Colosseum unique was not just its scale but its precision. The timing of gates, the acoustics of screams, the choreography of combat, it all created a psychological experience that overwhelmed the senses. Spectators were not passive, they were consumed by the spectacle, swept into a frenzy that dissolved ordinary moral boundaries. Even the exits were part of the design. The vomitoria allowed tens of thousands to leave within minutes, funneling the emotional energy of the crowd back into the streets of Rome. Citizens carried the memory of the bloodshed with them, reinforcing loyalty, fear, and fascination. The Colosseum was not just an amphitheater. It was propaganda in stone. It demonstrated Rome's wealth, its engineering genius, its absolute authority over life and death. To sit in its stands was to participate in empire. To watch its shows was to internalize the lessons of obedience and power. And so, what had begun as funeral games now reached its architectural climax. Rome no longer needed rituals to honor the dead. It had built a machine to honor itself, a monument to cruelty disguised as entertainment. Beneath the arches and marble lay not just bricks and mortar, but a system of control that turned every drop of blood into proof of Rome's greatness. By the height of the empire, gladiatorial combat was only one part of the show. The Romans, insatiable in their appetite for spectacle, demanded variety, new horrors, new ways to turn human death into public performance. What emerged was a catalogue of cruelty unmatched in history, where executions themselves became theater. One of the most dreaded punishments was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was no ordinary execution. It was choreographed destruction. Criminals, prisoners of war, and rebellious slaves were forced into the arena to face wild animals starved for days before release. Sometimes victims were tied to posts, helpless as lions circled closer, their growls echoing off stone. Other times, they were given crude wooden weapons, a cruel illusion of fairness. The outcome was never in doubt. Lions, bears, and tigers tore through flesh as the crowd roared. For the spectators, it was both thrilling and symbolic. Each mauling reminded them of Rome's power, of the futility of resistance. The animals themselves were drawn from across the empire, lions from Nubia, tigers from Persia, elephants from Africa, even rhinoceroses and hippos dragged from distant lands. Their presence was proof of Rome's reach, its ability to command nature as well as man. Records from Emperor Trajan's celebrations note that more than 11,000 animals were slaughtered in a single festival. The sheer logistics, feeding, transporting, releasing, required entire industries. But beyond logistics, the psychological impact mattered most. To see a man devoured alive stripped away the thin veneer of civilization. As Roman writers admitted, crowds became intoxicated, their bloodlust ignited. For many, it was a disturbing reminder of how fragile humanity was when faced with raw nature. For the state, it was a powerful lesson: Rome could unleash terror at will. If this spectacle displayed the empire's dominance over nature, another form of execution showcased its dominance over culture itself. These were the so-called fatal charades. In these productions, condemned prisoners were forced to reenact mythological stories, only their deaths were real. A man might be dressed as Orpheus, given a lyre, and placed in the arena with wild beasts. Unlike the mythical Orpheus, he had no power to charm them. His song ended in screams as lions tore him apart. Another prisoner might play Deadliest, fitted with wax wings and pushed from a high platform. When he fell, broken on the sand, wild animals were released to finish the scene. The irony was deliberate. Rome reveled in turning legend into cruelty, in twisting familiar stories into bloody finales. Some punishments targeted women in particularly degrading ways. Female prisoners could be forced to play Pasiphae, the mythical queen who mated with a bull. Bound inside wooden frames shaped like cows, they were gored or trampled before jeering crowds. Others were subjected to sexual humiliation before death, reflecting Rome's deep anxieties about gender, sexuality, and social boundaries. The myth of Prometheus also became a gruesome script. Prisoners were chained to posts while trained birds of prey, eagles or vultures, were set upon them. The birds were taught to attack specific body parts, tearing flesh slowly to prolong agony. Unlike the god of myth, the condemned had no regeneration. They died slowly, their torment amplified by recognition of the story they were forced to embody. Costumes, props, scenery, all were crafted with care. Rome's stagehands transformed the arena into a theater of myth, complete with painted backdrops and choreographed entrances. It was, in a sense, Rome's form of drama. The curtain always fell in real blood. Perhaps the most infamous form of Roman execution was the creation of human torches, known as tunica molesta. Prisoners were dressed in rough shirts soaked in pitch, resin, and wax. Once lit, their bodies became blazing lanterns. Emperor Nero perfected this horror during his persecution of Christians. Ancient sources describe his gardens illuminated by burning victims, their screams mingling with music and laughter. Nero, dressed as a charioteer, supposedly rode among them, treating their suffering as spectacle for his parties. The Colosseum too incorporated this punishment. Posts with iron rings for binding victims were built into the infrastructure. Drainage channels carried away the melted fat of the burning. Roman physicians even observed the process with scientific detachment, noting how flames consumed flesh, how long consciousness lasted, and which mixtures produced slower burns. The cruelty doubled as crude research. To the state, burning criminals symbolized purification. Fire destroyed not only the body but the stain of crime. To the crowd, it was horrifying and mesmerizing, a literal embodiment of Rome's power to consume its enemies. Why did Romans watch such horrors? Part of the answer lies in desensitization. For centuries, war and death had been constants in Roman life. To see violence packaged into entertainment felt natural. But there was also something deeper. The arena provided catharsis, a release of fear and aggression, a reassurance that Rome's enemies were always weaker, always doomed. The state reinforced this by framing executions as justice. Criminals were punished not in the shadows but before tens of thousands, their deaths doubling as moral lessons. The mythological scripts gave cultural weight, linking Rome's brutality with the authority of its stories and gods. The burning torches provided symbolism, turning executions into spectacles of purification. But beneath all the justification lay raw appetite. Crowds came because they wanted to see something unforgettable. Blood, fire, beasts, Rome gave them what they demanded. And in return, the people gave loyalty, or at least obedience. For those condemned, the arena was the end of hope. They entered not as men and women but as props in a state-sponsored performance. Their lives were consumed to satisfy political ambition, public hunger, and imperial vanity. For the victims, there was no dignity, only spectacle. Even philosophers struggled with what this said about Roman society. Seneca, horrified by executions disguised as myth, wrote of leaving the arena feeling corrupted, more cruel, less human. Augustine and other later Christian thinkers argued that such spectacles degraded not only the victims but the viewers, destroying compassion and numbing souls. Yet, for centuries, the shows continued. For every critic, there were thousands who cheered. Rome had woven cruelty into the very fabric of its culture. And so, in the blaze of human torches, in the screams of prisoners torn by lions, in the staged falls of men dressed as gods, the Roman arena revealed its truest nature, not merely a theater of death, but a mirror of empire itself. It was organized, calculated, endlessly inventive, and utterly merciless. If the Colosseum was a theater of death, then the Naumachii, mock naval battles, were its grandest productions. These spectacles pushed Roman ingenuity and cruelty to their limits, transforming solid ground into seas of slaughter. To the citizens of Rome, there was nothing more astonishing than watching entire fleets clash in an arena that had, only hours before, been a dry expanse of sand. The first great Naumachia was staged by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE. To celebrate his military victories, he ordered a massive basin dug near the Campus Martius, flooding it to create an artificial lake. Into this watery stage, he sent 2,000 condemned men aboard 400 ships, reenacting battles between Egypt and Phoenicia. There was no escape. The ships were real, the weapons sharp, and the blood spilled into the water was not staged. Thousands died as tens of thousands cheered. Later emperors expanded the concept. Augustus built a permanent lake for naval spectacles near the Tiber River, capable of hosting full-scale warships. Claudius staged an enormous Naumachia on Lake Fucine, using actual fleets manned by condemned prisoners. And in the Colosseum itself, ingenious water systems allowed the floor to be flooded and drained within hours. For audiences, it was pure wonder. One day the arena roared with lions, the next it rippled with waves and the clash of oars. The logistics were staggering. Engineers constructed drainage tunnels, hidden pumps, and mechanical devices to create waves, currents, even floating debris for realism. Shipbuilders fashioned scaled-down triremes and galleys strong enough to ram yet light enough for shallow water. Prisoners, many of them captured soldiers, received crash courses in naval combat, though their fate was sealed regardless. When the battle ended, survivors were often executed to complete the spectacle. For the state, the Naumachii symbolized ultimate control. Rome not only conquered land and sea, it could recreate them at will, bending nature to imperial desire. The message to the crowd was unmistakable: the empire's power was boundless, its reach absolute. But Rome's hunger for mass violence went beyond naval shows. Festivals themselves became stages for killing on a scale that defies belief. During triumphal celebrations or religious holidays, executions and combats multiplied into days or even months of carnage. The victory of Emperor Trajan over Dacia in the early 2nd century CE was marked by games lasting 123 days, featuring the deaths of over 10,000 men and 11,000 animals, according to ancient sources. Even if exaggerated, the numbers reveal the unimaginable scope of Roman slaughter. Festival slaughters blended entertainment with ritual. Holidays like the Floralia or Saturnalia might conclude with gladiatorial combats, beast hunts, and executions. These events linked violence to the cycles of the gods, cloaking carnage in sacred meaning. To the Romans, mass death could be both worship and spectacle. The organization of such events resembled military campaigns. Prisoners were gathered from across the empire, transported to Rome, and housed in holding cells until their appointed day. Exotic animals were shipped from distant provinces, fed just enough to survive the journey, then starved before release. Weapons and armor were stockpiled, stages constructed, drainage prepared, and vast amounts of food distributed to appease the crowd. Entire regions built economies around supplying Rome's appetite for blood. When the festival began, the arena transformed into a carnival of death. In one corner, criminals might be crucified. In another, men were thrown to beasts. Fires blazed, gladiators fought, and naval battles played out in flooded basins. Audiences moved from spectacle to spectacle as though browsing a marketplace of cruelty, selecting their preferred form of entertainment. Diversity of execution kept the masses engaged and the bloodlust sharp. The atmosphere during these mass killings was unlike anything else in Roman life. Contemporary accounts describe crowds descending into frenzy, voices merging into a single roar, the smell of blood mixing with incense and food. Witnesses spoke of ecstasy, of being swept into a collective passion that blurred lines between worship and savagery. It was not simply watching, it was participating, a communal intoxication fed by violence. Provincial governors, too, used mass spectacles to prove loyalty to Rome. Hosting elaborate games for visiting emperors became a test of administrative competence and wealth. Fail to impress, and a governor risked disgrace or removal. Succeed, and he secured imperial favor. Across the empire, amphitheaters echoed with the same scenes, blood, beasts, and cheering crowds. But behind every roar of approval lay thousands of silenced lives. Prisoners of war who once fought for their people now drowned in artificial lakes. Slaves who had hoped for freedom died as human props in mythological plays. Wild animals, ripped from their natural homes, were slaughtered to amuse audiences thousands of miles away. Still, for the Romans, these spectacles reinforced their identity. To be Roman was to dominate. To conquer. To orchestrate death so completely that even nature itself obeyed. In the flooded basins of the Naumachii, in the blood-soaked festivals, Rome displayed not only its cruelty but its genius. It was organization elevated to brutality, engineering turned into theater, politics played out in slaughter. And in the stands, the people screamed louder, demanding more. They wanted the thrill of surprise, the awe of scale, the assurance that Rome would never run out of enemies to kill or beasts to slay. The empire obliged, for as long as it could bear the cost. What had begun as sacred duty at funerals had become an unstoppable machine of mass death. Naval battles on man-made lakes, festivals of killing stretching for months, whole economies built on supplying blood, this was the Rome that history remembers, the Rome that dazzled and horrified in equal measure. The frenzy of the masses was not an accident. It was the point. In their cries, in their frenzy, the empire found its proof of legitimacy. If tens of thousands cheered while thousands died, then surely Rome was unshakable. Surely the gods themselves approved. Yet even in the roar of the Colosseum, some must have wondered, how long could a civilization sustain itself on so much blood? Behind the thunder of the crowds and the grandeur of the Colosseum were real people, men and women whose lives were consumed to keep the empire entertained. To the Roman state, gladiators were both tools and commodities. To the spectators, they were heroes and victims, admired and despised at the same time. But beneath the myth, the reality was harsher than the sand itself. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals condemned to fight. Some volunteered, lured by promises of fame, money, or even freedom, though they were the exception rather than the rule. Once chosen, they were sent to a ludus, a gladiator school. These institutions were part prison, part barracks, part training camp, and part business enterprise. Owners invested heavily in their fighters, and the lives of men became financial calculations written in scars and broken bones. Inside the ludi, life was strict and brutal. Gladiators lived in cramped cells, watched constantly by guards. Their days were filled with drills, practicing with wooden swords, learning to fight in specific styles, enduring grueling exercises to strengthen their bodies. Each man was trained to embody a role, the heavily armed Mirmillo with a broad shield and helmet, the nimble Retiarius with a net and trident, the secutor, designed to chase down his opponents. Each role had its symbolism, its strengths, and its weaknesses. Medical care in the schools was advanced for its time. Physicians set bones, stitched wounds, and studied ways to keep fighters alive after brutal injuries. But this care was not born of compassion, it was economic necessity. A trained gladiator could cost as much as a villa, and every death meant a financial loss for his owner. Paradoxically, men were healed only so they could fight again, their bodies preserved for the next bout of blood. Despite the cruelty, gladiators often became public idols. In Pompeii, graffiti praises certain fighters by name, boasting of their victories and attractiveness to women. Crowds adored their skill, cheered their bravery, and placed bets on their lives. Some gladiators achieved celebrity status, earning privileges and even the possibility of rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom after surviving enough matches. Yet for most, freedom was a dream they would never reach. Statistics drawn from gladiator tombstones reveal the grim odds. The average career lasted only 2 to 5 years. Experienced fighters faced a roughly 10% chance of death in any given combat. To survive dozens of fights required incredible skill, extraordinary luck, and the fickle favor of the crowd. Even the most famous eventually fell, their names fading from walls into dust. Women, too, found themselves drawn into the orbit of the arena. Some became gladiators in rare, sensational matches staged for novelty. Dressed in armor, they fought each other to the delight of spectators who viewed female combat as titillating entertainment. These women, often slaves or desperate volunteers, faced the same mortal risks as men while enduring additional ridicule and exploitation. For the Roman audience, their deaths reinforced ideas of gender and power, turning humiliation into spectacle. Beyond the arena walls, the families of gladiators bore silent suffering. Though gladiators could marry and have children, their relationships existed under constant threat. A husband might leave for training or combat and never return. Wives lived with the knowledge that their partners' lives were owned by the state or a wealthy lanista, gladiator manager. Children grew up with fathers whose deaths were awaited by cheering crowds. Social stigma followed them. To be the wife or child of a gladiator was to carry a mark of dishonor. Even if a gladiator gained fame, his family remained on the margins of society, facing suspicion, exploitation, and poverty. When a fighter died, his wife might be enslaved, his children left destitute, his family broken as surely as his body in the sand. Modern psychology gives us words the Romans never had: trauma, depression, post-traumatic stress. Ancient accounts hint at gladiators who refused to fight, attempted suicide, or collapsed in despair. For the Romans, these were inconveniences. For the men themselves, they were glimpses of humanity breaking through the armor of violence. And yet, in the midst of this brutality, some gladiators achieved astonishing loyalty from their fans. They were remembered in graffiti as the heartthrobs of the girls, or the favorites of the people. Spectators followed their careers, celebrated their victories, and mourned their deaths. A handful even earned their freedom and lived as heroes. But even then, their bodies carried scars that never faded, and their souls bore memories they could never forget. The contradictions of gladiator life reveal the complexity of Rome itself. These men were despised as criminals and slaves yet adored as celebrities. They were preserved with the best medical care only to be thrown back into combat. They were cheered as heroes but denied humanity. To Rome, they were symbols of power, of entertainment, of the empire's ability to own life itself. Consider the gladiator's walk into the arena. He emerges from the darkness of the hypogeum, the crowd screaming, the sunlight blinding. He knows that with every step, he carries not only his fate but the honor of his owner, the expectations of the crowd, and the lesson Rome wants to teach. If he dies, he proves Rome's dominance. If he lives, he fights again, perhaps another day closer to freedom. Either way, he is never truly his own. The arena consumed not only the fighters but their families, their futures, their humanity. It was a system that turned men into property, property into performers, and performers into corpses. And through it all, the people cheered, blind to the cost, eager for the next clash of steel. In the end, gladiators were both victims and symbols, living reminders that in Rome, life and death were not private matters but public currency. Their families paid the price, their bodies bore the scars, their names were written in graffiti and epitaphs that tell us today what the crowds once screamed: Rome devoured its own, one fight at a time. For nearly 7 centuries, the roar of Roman crowds echoed above the blood-soaked sands. But no empire, no matter how powerful, can sustain such an appetite forever. The arena that once embodied Rome's strength slowly became a burden too costly, too morally indefensible, and too dangerous to maintain. Its decline was gradual, shaped by shifting faith, faltering finances, and the changing soul of the empire. The first cracks appeared in the 4th century CE, when Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity. Although he did not abolish gladiatorial games outright, he forbade the use of condemned criminals in combat. This decision effectively ended the death penalty as entertainment. His reasoning was not purely economic but theological. Christianity condemned judicial murder disguised as spectacle. For centuries, blood had been Rome's offering to its gods. Now a new faith demanded mercy, not slaughter. Still, old habits died hard. Gladiatorial schools continued to operate, and some contests survived in diminished form. But the heart of the spectacle, the systematic execution of criminals and prisoners, began to fade. Without the lethal edge, the games lost much of their allure. Economics delivered another blow. The grandeur of the spectacles had always come at staggering costs. Exotic animals had to be imported across continents. Thousands of prisoners had to be housed, fed, and transported. Engineers maintained elaborate infrastructure to stage naval battles and mythological reenactments. As Rome's empire strained under invasions, plagues, and financial collapse, the games became luxuries the state could no longer afford. Provincial cities that once competed to host extravagant games found their treasuries empty. Governors faced pressure to defend borders, repair infrastructure, and feed populations. Funding spectacles was no longer a priority, and amphitheaters that once roared with death fell into disrepair. Meanwhile, tastes shifted. Chariot racing rose to prominence as the preferred entertainment of the masses. The Hippodrome of Constantinople became the new heart of imperial leisure, its races dangerous but rarely fatal on the scale of gladiatorial combat. Spectators transferred their passions from gladiator factions to chariot teams, the blues, the greens, whose rivalries consumed entire cities. The appeal was similar: speed, danger, spectacle. But the moral stain of systematic human slaughter was absent. By the 5th century, gladiatorial combat was a relic. The last recorded contest took place in 435 CE, long after Rome had lost much of its former glory. In some corners of the empire, particularly North Africa, the shows lingered longer. But elsewhere, especially in regions where Roman culture had never fully taken root, the arenas grew silent. The physical structures themselves changed. The Colosseum, once the beating heart of Rome, was repurposed. Workshops and homes were built inside its walls. Stones were scavenged for other buildings. Yet the ruins endured, a hulking reminder of a darker past. To walk through its arches even then was to feel the ghosts of thousands who had died within. The Christian Church condemned the games, with figures like Augustine and Jerome writing passionately against them. They argued that the spectacles corrupted souls, degraded compassion, and turned justice into cruelty. Their voices, combined with imperial edicts, helped to seal the fate of the gladiatorial system. Rome, once a civilization that celebrated blood, now sought salvation in mercy. But the legacy of the arena did not vanish. It mutated, resurfacing in new forms across the centuries. Medieval Europe carried echoes of Rome in its tournaments, where knights clashed before cheering crowds. Though not designed as executions, these contests preserved the same fascination with combat as entertainment. Public executions, too, inherited the theatricality of Rome. The scaffold became a stage, the condemned an actor in society's play of justice. Methods of execution, burning, quartering, hanging, were chosen not just for punishment but for their dramatic effect. Even modern sports carry fragments of the Roman legacy. Stadiums are modeled on amphitheaters, designed to hold tens of thousands in shared excitement. The organization of crowds, the elevation of athletes as celebrities, the spectacle of controlled violence, these are inheritances from Rome's arenas. The difference is that today, the violence is regulated, symbolic rather than fatal. Yet the same hunger for spectacle lingers. The Colosseum itself stands as both monument and warning. Millions of tourists walk its corridors each year, marveling at the engineering genius, shuddering at the cruelty. Museums display gladiator weapons, inscriptions, and skeletons, reminding us that behind the myth were real human beings. Scholars study the arenas not as curiosities but as windows into how societies justify violence, how power sustains itself through spectacle. And in our culture, films, novels, video games, the gladiator myth endures. From Hollywood's Gladiator to modern retellings of Rome's brutality, the story is retold with new faces, new morals, but the same fascination. We romanticize courage, condemn cruelty, but remain enthralled by the drama. Perhaps that is Rome's truest legacy, the uneasy truth that humanity has always been drawn to violence, not only as survival but as spectacle. We may cloak it in different forms, sports, stories, cinema, but the fascination endures. The Romans knew this. They built entire cities around it. When the sands finally grew silent in 435 CE, it marked the end of an era. But the echoes carried forward, shaping centuries of culture. The amphitheaters of Rome were never just about blood. They were about who we are, about how easily we can turn death into theater, cruelty into entertainment. The Colosseum, scarred and broken, still stands because its story is not finished. It speaks to tourists, to historians, to anyone who listens. Remember what was done here. Remember what people cheered for. And ask yourself why. Rome's arenas are gone, but the questions they leave remain.